The galaxy had one rule: never wake the sleeping fleet hidden around Sol. Before we dive deeper into this story, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The Galactic Conclave had catalogued over 40,000 rules since its founding. Rules about territorial boundaries, resource extraction rights, diplomatic immunity, the ethical treatment of pre-spaceflight civilizations, the handling of artificial intelligence in warfare, and the proper filing of interstellar trade disputes. 40,000 rules, and most of them were argued about endlessly in marble-walled chambers by ambassadors who had built entire careers on finding loopholes. But there was one rule that nobody argued about. One rule that veteran diplomats whispered to new recruits on their very first day. One rule that appeared in no official document, carried no legal weight, and yet was obeyed with a reverence that bordered on religious devotion by every species in the known galaxy. Never approach Sol. The rule had existed for as long as humanity had been part of the Conclave. Nobody remembered exactly who first said it or when. It had simply emerged organically the way all great warnings do, passed from mouth to mouth, from species to species, from generation to generation, until it became part of the galaxy's collective memory. Some believed it was rooted in early encounters with human defense systems that had surprised visiting scouts. Others thought it was invented by humanity itself, a piece of psychological theater designed to make a young, small civilization seem more dangerous than it was. The Vreth, for their part, had always believed the latter. They were a species built for confidence. 19 star systems. 40 years of continuous military expansion. Their warships were works of terrifying art, long and angular, plated in a compound alloy that could withstand sustained plasma bombardment, armed with mass driver cannons that could crack the crust of a small moon. They had absorbed 4 civilizations in the last century, not through brutal conquest, but through something they considered more elegant. They would arrive. They would demonstrate capability. The other civilization would calculate the odds, and then they would quietly agree to terms. It was efficient. It was clean. And it had worked every single time. High Admiral Sorvak had commanded the Vreth expansion fleet for 11 years. He was not a cruel being. He was, by his own understanding, simply a pragmatist. When the resource survey came back with data pointing to Sol's asteroid belt, he had reviewed it twice, set it aside, reviewed it a third time, and then called his senior officers into the command chamber. The numbers were extraordinary. Rare isotopes, platinum group metals, carbonaceous material dense enough to supply their entire manufacturing sector for a century. The asteroid belt alone was worth more than every resource extraction operation the Vreth currently ran combined. And it was sitting in the territory of a species that, by every measurable metric, could not stop them from taking it. The rule, his first officer, Commander Veth, had said carefully, is a ghost story. Sorvak had not even looked up from the survey data. Invented by a species that understood the value of appearing dangerous. I respect the strategy. But I will not surrender a century of wealth to a myth. Nobody in the room had argued further. That was the thing about Sorvak. He was persuasive not because he shouted, but because his logic was always airtight, his confidence perfectly calibrated, his record unblemished. 42 successful expansion operations. Not one shot fired in anger. The fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system on what humans would have called a Tuesday morning. 40 warships. The finest vessels in the Vreth arsenal. Their formation was textbook. Widespread, overlapping defensive fields, every scanner array active at maximum range. Nothing happened. The scanners showed civilian traffic. Small mining vessels, cargo haulers, a few passenger ships running between stations. They scattered the moment the Vreth fleet appeared, which was expected. Sorvak watched them go with the detached interest of someone observing insects. Any military response? He asked. Negative, Admiral. No weapons locks. No active targeting. A few communication buoys just lit up, likely automated distress signals. Sorvak nodded slowly. Continue inward. Standard formation. They moved past Neptune without incident. Past Uranus. The outer system was hauntingly quiet, vast and cold, the sun a distant bright point rather than the warm star it was up close. Their scanners swept constantly, painting a picture of a system that seemed entirely undefended. A few orbital stations. Automated relay networks. The faint energy signatures of what appeared to be research outposts on distant moons. Nothing military. Nothing threatening. The asteroid belt glittered on their long-range sensors like a field of gold. Veth moved to stand beside Sorvak at the command viewport. Still nothing, she said quietly. There was something in her voice that wasn't quite relief. Something that sounded almost like unease. Noted, Sorvok said. And irrelevant. They were 40 minutes inside the system when the silence changed. It didn't announce itself. There was no alarm, no weapon signature, no sudden burst of energy on the sensors. It was quieter than that, and somehow that made it infinitely worse. Every scanner on every Vreth ship went dark simultaneously. Not damaged, dark. Powered down, as if something had simply reached inside their systems and pressed a switch. The command bridge of Sorvok's flagship plunged into the dim red glow of emergency lighting. For 3 seconds, every officer on every ship in his fleet held their breath. When the scanners came back online, the data they returned stopped Sorvok's heart. 473 vessels. Surrounding them. At every angle. High, low, fore, aft, port, starboard. Arranged in a perfect three-dimensional formation that should have been mathematically impossible to construct without detection. The ships were enormous. Each one longer than the largest Vreth military station. Their hulls matte black and cold, built from a material that absorbed every scanning frequency the Conclave had ever catalogued. They had no running lights. No energy signatures. They had been sitting there, in the darkness between planets, drifting in the silence of space, for what the residual thermal data on their hulls suggested was decades. Not days. Not months. Decades. Sorvok stood very still. He was a being who had built his career on reading tactical situations faster than anyone else in the room. And what his mind told him right now, with a clarity that was almost peaceful in its finality, was this. He had made a catastrophic error. Admiral. Veth's voice was barely a whisper. They're not powering weapons. He already knew that. He had noticed. The human ships, and they were human ships, the design language was unmistakable once you saw it, angular and industrial and utterly purposeful, were simply sitting there. Watching. Their mere presence was the weapon. The message was delivered not by targeting systems or warning shots, but by the simple, overwhelming fact of what they were and how many there were and how completely, impossibly hidden they had been until this exact moment. The transmission came through on an open channel, in perfect Vreth dialect, spoken in the measured, unhurried voice of an artificial intelligence that carried in every syllable the absolute certainty of something that had been waiting patiently for a very long time. This is Terran Shepard Fleet Autonomous Defense Network 7. You are transmitting on all civilian distress frequencies, which confirms your identity. You have entered Protected Sovereign Exclusion Zone Alpha without authorization. This zone carries Galactic Conclave Treaty Designation 001, established 63 standard years ago. You have 30 seconds to begin full withdrawal. This warning will not be repeated. 30 seconds. Sorvok's tactical officer turned from his console with the expression of a being whose understanding of the universe had just been fundamentally restructured. Admiral, I'm reading power builds on all 473 contacts. They're not targeting us. The energy signatures they're aimed outward. They're not preparing to fire at us. They're prepared to fire at anything that tries to come to our aid, Sorvok said very quietly. Or anything that tries to intervene. The tactical picture assembled itself in his mind with horrible clarity. This wasn't a defensive fleet. This was a statement. A message left in the dark, waiting to be delivered to exactly this kind of moment. The humans hadn't built this to fight a war. They had built it so that no war would ever need to be fought. Every ship in that formation was a word in a sentence that read, "We saw you coming before you left your home system, and we let you walk all the way here so that you could understand exactly what you were walking into." 20 seconds. Veth. His voice was steady. He had made a decision. Begin withdrawal. Full speed. All ships. She didn't hesitate. She was already moving to her console before he finished the sentence. Because she was smart, and she understood, and she had perhaps understood for longer than she had been willing to say out loud. The Vreth fleet turned. All 40 ships, in disciplined formation, reversed course and accelerated toward the edge of the Sol system. There was no dignity in it, and Sorvok knew it and accepted it, because dignity was something you held on to when it was worth the cost, and right now the only thing worth preserving was his fleet and his people's future relationship with a civilization he had catastrophically underestimated. The Shepard fleet did not pursue. They didn't need to. They returned to their positions in the dark, and the scanners faded, and the Sol system went quiet again as if nothing had happened. As if 40 warships had simply been politely shown the door. It took the Vreth fleet 6 hours to clear the system boundary. During those 6 hours, Sorvok stood at the command viewport and didn't speak a single word to anyone. He was thinking. Rebuilding his understanding of humanity from the foundation up, examining every diplomatic interaction he had ever reviewed, every trade agreement, every conclave session where the human ambassador had smiled pleasantly and asked thoughtful questions and seemed, always, like the most reasonable and accessible species in the room. They had been building this fleet for 63 years. Before Sorvok was born. Before his father was born. They had been constructing these ships, one by one, in silence, in the dark between planets, funding the operation through mechanisms that had apparently never appeared on any financial intelligence report any conclave species had ever produced. They had designed a hull material that was invisible to every known scanning technology. They had built an autonomous AI network capable of managing nearly 500 vessels simultaneously. And they had done all of this while smiling at conclave meetings and filing trade paperwork and asking polite questions about galactic culture. The thing that broke something open in Sorvok's chest, as he stood there in the dark watching the distant glow of Sol fade behind him, was the realization that humanity had never threatened anyone with this. They had never used it as leverage. Never mentioned it in a negotiation. Never let a single rumor leak to create fear. They had simply built it, maintained it, and waited, not because they wanted to frighten the galaxy, but because they understood that the only deterrent worth having was one that spoke for itself, in the moment it was needed, without a single word of advance warning. The Galactic Conclave emergency session convened 48 hours after the Vreth fleet filed its incident report. The document was classified at the highest level, but within 6 hours, every ambassador in the conclave knew its contents. The session lasted 3 days. The chamber, which had hosted thousands of years of interstellar argument, was quieter during those 3 days than it had ever been. Intelligence agencies across 12 species began frantically searching their records for anything they might have missed. Any hint, any shadow, any anomaly that should have pointed to what was sitting in the dark around Sol. They found nothing. Not because the data hadn't existed but because they had never thought to look for it. Humanity had been so thoroughly categorized as a minor, manageable, commercially valuable but militarily negligible species that the possibility of a hidden fleet of this scale had never entered anyone's analytical framework. On the third day of the emergency session, Elder Thesavik of the Keth Dominion rose to speak. She was the oldest active member of the conclave, 240 years old, having served as ambassador through events most other species only read about in history files. When she rose, the chamber went completely silent without anyone calling for order. She did not speak immediately. She looked around the room for a long moment, meeting the eyes of ambassadors from species that had traded with humanity, competed with humanity, occasionally condescended to humanity in the polite and indirect way that galactic politics permitted. Then she folded her hands. I was in this chamber, she said, 63 years ago, when humanity's ambassador stood before us and formally registered Treaty 001, the sovereign exclusion zone around Sol. We debated the request for 4 hours. Some argued the zone was too large. Others questioned the precedent. The humans sat quietly through every argument, answered every question patiently, and waited. She paused. We approved it by a comfortable majority. And then we moved on to other business because it seemed like a small thing. A young species asking to feel safe in their own home system. Understandable. Unremarkable. Another pause, longer this time. We never asked why they needed it. We assumed we already knew the answer. The chamber was absolutely still. The rule was never superstition, she said. It was not a myth invented by cowards, or a bluff constructed by a weak species to seem dangerous. She let the silence stretch for 3 full seconds before she finished. It was a warning placed there by the humans themselves, the moment they joined this conclave. And we almost forgot who put it there. She sat down. No one spoke for a very long time. In the Sol system, in the dark between worlds, 473 ships drifted back into their silent formations. Their engines cooled. Their hulls faded once more into the background radiation of space, invisible and patient, as they had been for 6 decades and would remain for however many decades came next. Waiting. Not for war. Not for conquest. Not for revenge. Just waiting for the next being to decide that the rule was a myth,